Chapter 1. The shadows grow in the dark alleys of New York's Little Italy, where the smell of fresh pasta mingled with cigar smoke and blood. Don Antonio Rossi reigned. He was a man of steel, with eyes that could pierce souls and a voice that whispered death sentences. Antonio had climbed from the filth of the streets to the top of the Rossi family, a mafia clan that ruled over gambling, protection rackets, and smuggling with an iron hand. His empire stretched from the docks of Brooklyn to the luxurious casinos of Atlantic City, but it was his family that was his true treasure. His wife, Maria, a woman with fiery red hair and a strength to match his own, and their son Marco, the sole heir whom Antonio saw as his future. Marco was 25 years old, a young man with his father's sharp features and his mother's passion. He had grown up in the shadow of violence, learned to handle a gun before he could drive a car, but Antonio had always tried to shield him from the worst of it. "You're my bloodline, my boy," Antonio would say, patting Marco's shoulder with a hand scarred from countless battles. "One day, all of this will be yours." But in the Mafia world, no one was safe, not even those who wore the crown. The conflict with the Morti clan had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Don Vincenzo Morti, an old rival from Sicily, had arrived in the city with ambitions that stretched far beyond his borders. His family controlled the drug trade in Queens, and they wanted more. The Rossis had always abided by the old codes: honor, loyalty, family, but the Mortis were like hungry wolves, ready to tear apart anything for profit. It started with small incidents: a truckload of contraband hijacked, a loyal soldier found floating in the East River with his throat slit. Antonio had sent warnings, but Vincenzo only laughed. "Times change, Antonio," he had said at a meeting in a neutral restaurant, his eyes glittering with scorn. "You're a relic from the old country, I'm the future." Antonio sat in his office upstairs at Rossi's trattoria, a front for his operations. The room was furnished in dark wood, with portraits of old godfathers on the walls and a massive mahogany table where deals were struck. Cigar smoke hung heavy in the air, and his consigliere Luigi, a thin man with glasses and a mind sharp as a razor, sat across from him. "Don, we need to hit back hard," Luigi said, his voice low so as not to rouse any eavesdroppers. "The Mortis have crossed the line. They're recruiting our guys." Antonio leaned back in his leather chair, fingers drumming on the table. His face was a map of wrinkles, every line a tale of survival. He thought of Marco, who was out on the streets collecting protection money from local businesses. The boy was eager, desperate to prove himself, but Antonio felt a gnawing worry in his chest. "Not yet, Luigi, we wait. A war costs more than it pays, but if they touch my family," his voice trailed off, but the message was clear: blood for blood. Outside the restaurant, the city pulsed. Marco drove his black Cadillac through the narrow streets with his best friend and bodyguard, Paolo, riding shotgun. Paolo was a giant of a man, his tattoos telling stories of prison time and unshakable loyalty. "Boss says we stay calm," Paolo muttered, chewing on a toothpick. "No stupid moves tonight." Marco grinned, his teeth flashing in the glow of street lamps. "My father worries too much. This is our city, Paolo. The Mortis are just rats that need a lesson." They pulled up outside a small deli on Mulberry Street, owned by an old family friend. Inside, the owner paid quickly, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Marco. Tell Don Antonio we're grateful." When they stepped back outside, Marco felt a chill in the air. It was too quiet. No cars, no pedestrians. "Paolo, something's wrong," he whispered, reaching for the gun in his holster. That's when the shots came. From the rooftop across the street, bullets rained down like hail. Chapter 2, The Call of Blood. After Marco's death, the air in the Rossi family headquarters was thick with grief and rage, like a storm waiting to break. Don Antonio Rossi sat in his dark office, surrounded by maps of the city, lists of names, and photographs of enemies. His eyes, usually sharp as knives, were now red from sleepless nights. Maria, his wife, had withdrawn to their bedroom, where she sat staring at Marco's childhood photos, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She spoke little now, her heart shattered into pieces that would never heal. "He was our future, Antonio," she had whispered once, before turning away. Antonio felt the weight of guilt pressing on his shoulders. He had promised to protect his family, and he had failed. Luigi, the consigliere, was the one holding everything together. A man of words rather than weapons, his mind was a labyrinth of strategies. "Don, we have to strike at their heart," he said one evening as they sat at the long table, surrounded by capos who listened intently. "The Mortys have a warehouse in the Bronx, full of their drugs. If we take it, we cut off their income." Antonio nodded slowly, fingers clenched around a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. "Do it. But I want Vincenzo to feel the pain personally, find his weaknesses." As plans were forged, Antonio's mind drifted to the old days. Flashbacks came like ghosts. Marco as a child, running through the garden of their Staten Island home, laughing as he chased butterflies. Antonio had taught him to shoot with a small pistol. "To protect what's yours, boy." Marco had hit the target perfectly, his eyes shining with pride. Now that memory was a knife in Antonio's chest. He visited Marco's grave every morning, standing there at dawn, swearing vengeance. "I'll get you justice," he muttered to the stone. Alliances began to form. Antonio reached out to the old families, what remained of the Gambinos, the Lucchese clan, men he had broken bread with for decades. A meeting took place in a hidden basement beneath a Manhattan church, where the priest turned a blind eye for a generous donation. "The Mortys are a cancer," Antonio told the assembled dons, his voice echoing off the cold walls. "They have no respect for the code. Help me, and you'll get a piece of their territory." Some nodded, others hesitated, but fear of a full-scale war pushed them toward alliance. One of them, Don Salvator from the Bronx, sent his best men to spy. But betrayal lurked in the shadows. One of Antonio's own capos, Gino, a young, ambitious man with a scar across his cheek, had begun to doubt. He saw Marco's death as a sign of Antonio's weakness. In secret, he met a Morty contact in a dark bar in Hell's Kitchen. "What's Vincenzo offering?" Gino whispered, his eyes darting. "More power, more money," the contact replied with a grin. Gino nodded, though his loyalty still wavered. He leaked information about an upcoming raid, unaware that Luigi had eyes everywhere. The raid on the Morty warehouse was a symphony of violence. Antonio led it personally, clad in a black coat and wielding a Tommy gun, a weapon from the old days. His men, 20 strong, stormed the dark building at midnight. The guards at the door were the first to die. One shot clean through the head, the other's throat slit, blood spraying like a fountain against the wall. Inside, chaos exploded. Morty soldiers opened fire, bullets screaming through the air, ripping into pallets of cocaine that burst into white clouds. Paolo, Marco's old bodyguard, charged forward like a bear, his shotgun roaring, tearing two men apart with a single blast. "For Marco," he bellowed, his face spattered with blood. Antonio moved like a shadow, his pistol firing with precision. He hit a man in the stomach, watched him fall and crawl in his own blood, begging for mercy. "No mercy for you," Antonio growled, stomping on the man's throat until it snapped. But betrayal struck. Gino had warned them, and reinforcements arrived. An explosion rocked the building, a bomb planted by Gino. Walls collapsed, men screamed as they were buried under rubble. Antonio felt pain as a bullet grazed his shoulder, warm blood seeping down his arm. In the heat of battle, Antonio confronted Gino. "You snake," he roared, seizing the capo by the collar. Gino pulled a knife, but Antonio was faster. A shot to the leg dropped him screaming. "Why?" Antonio demanded, pressing the gun to his forehead. "You're old, Don. The Mortys are the future." Antonio pulled the trigger. Gino's brain splattered across the floor in a red mess. The traitor was dead, but the price was high. 5 of Antonio's men lay lifeless, their bodies riddled with bullets. When the raid was over, they burned the warehouse to the ground, flames rising to the sky like a signal to Vincenzo. Antonio stood watching, his shoulder bandaged, the pain a reminder of loss. "This is only the beginning," he muttered. Back home, Maria waited, her eyes alight with a new fire. "Did you kill them?" she asked. "Yes, darling, for Marco." She nodded, and for the first time since their son's death, she gave a faint smile, but the war escalated. Vincenzo sent his revenge. A car bomb outside Rossi's trattoria killing 2 innocent waiters and injuring Luigi. The consigliere lay in the hospital, his leg broken but his mind razor-sharp. "We have to find Vincenzo's family," he whispered to Antonio. "His brother in Chicago, strike where it hurts." Antonio planned his next move, alliances sealed in blood. Flashbacks continued to haunt him. Marco as a teenager, winning his first street fight, Antonio clapping him on the back. "You're a Rossi," he had said. Now that memory drove him forward. Chapter 3, The Poison of Betrayal. The night was cold, and rain lashed against the streets of New York, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the blood that had been spilled. In the Rossi family headquarters, an old brick building hidden behind the facade of a wine import company in Brooklyn, Don Antonio Rossi sat at a table littered with maps, weapons, and half-empty glasses of whiskey. His shoulder, still sore from the bullet that had grazed him during the Bronx raid, throbbed in time with his heartbeat. But the pain was only fuel now. Marco's death had lit a fire that could not be extinguished, and every step Antonio took moved him closer to Vincenzo Morti's downfall. Yet Gino's betrayal had planted a poison in his mind. Who could he trust now? Luigi, the consigliere, was still in the hospital, his leg in a cast, but his mind as sharp as ever. Over a secure phone line, he gave his orders. "Don, we have to root out the traitors before we move forward. If Gino could turn, others might too." Antonio nodded, though Luigi couldn't see it. He stared out the window where rain drummed against the bulletproof glass. "I know, old friend, but it's like hunting shadows." And in the shadows, danger truly lurked. The Rossi family was strong, but cracks had begun to show. Gino's death had sent shockwaves through the organization. Some of the younger soldiers whispered in the corridors, unsure if Antonio's iron grip was still firm. One of them, a wiry newcomer named Carlo with hungry eyes, had started asking questions. "Is the Don too old for this?" he'd said to a group of men over a smoky card game in a basement. The words reached Paolo, Marco's former bodyguard, and now Antonio's ever-present shadow. Paolo, whose loyalty was carved in stone, reported everything to his boss. Antonio called a meeting in the trattoria basement. The room was bare, lit by a single light bulb, casting long shadows on the concrete walls. His capos stood around the table, their faces a mix of loyalty and unease. Paolo, his tattoos glinting in the dim light, guarded the door with a pistol in hand. "We have a rat," Antonio said, his voice low but dripping with menace. "And I'm going to find out who." He tossed a stack of photos on the table, pictures of Carlo meeting an unknown man in an alley, taken by a loyal spy. Carlo went pale, his hands trembling. "Don, it's not what you think." Antonio raised a hand, silencing him. "You speak when I tell you to speak." He walked slowly around the table, like a panther circling its prey. "You met with one of Morti's men. What did they offer you?" "Money." "Power?" Carlo tried to rise, but Paolo was there, a massive hand forcing him back into the chair. I just wanted to protect the family," Carlo stammered. Antonio leaned close, his breath hot against Carlo's face. "Protect the family? You sold us out." A single gunshot echoed through the room, and Carlo's body slumped to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The other capos sat silent, their eyes fixed on Antonio. "Anyone else want to test me?" he asked. No one answered. Outside headquarters, the war raged on. Antonio received intelligence about Vincenzo Morti's brother, Roberto, who ran an illegal gambling den in Chicago. Roberto was Vincenzo's right hand, just as cruel, but far less clever. "We take him," Antonio told Paolo. "We cut into their heart." The plan was simple but brutal. A small crew led by Paolo would infiltrate the gambling den and eliminate Roberto. Antonio couldn't go himself. His presence would draw too much attention, but he gave Paolo his full trust. "Do it for Marco," he said, gripping Paolo's shoulder. In Chicago, the night buzzed with neon lights as Paolo and his 5-man crew, eyes cold and weapons loaded, approached the gambling den hidden in the basement of an old theater. Guards stood at every door. Paolo, dressed in a cheap suit to blend in, entered with a forged invitation. Inside, the room was thick with smoke, laughter, and the clatter of poker chips. Roberto sat at a table, cigar in his mouth, flanked by bodyguards. Paolo gave the signal, and his men moved. Grenades rolled across the floor, erupting in deafening blasts. Gunfire tore through the room, tables overturned, gamblers screamed in panic. Paolo lunged forward, his knife flashing as he slit a guard's throat. Roberto tried to run, but a bullet shattered his knee. He collapsed, screaming, as Paolo loomed over him. "This is from Antonio," Paolo said, pulling the trigger. Roberto's body jerked once, then went still, but victory came at a cost. 2 of Paolo's men were killed in the firefight, their bodies left behind in the chaos as the crew escaped. Back in New York, Paolo reported to Antonio, his face smeared with dirt and blood. "It's done, Don. Roberto is dead," Antonio nodded, but his eyes were hollow. "Good, but Vincenzo still lives." As the war raged, Antonio was haunted by memories. He recalled a night when Marco was 16, the 2 of them sitting on their roof, staring at the stars. "Papa, will I ever be like you?" Marco had asked. Antonio laughed, mussing his hair. "You'll be better, boy." Now the memory was a dagger, a reminder of what he had lost. Maria, regaining her strength, became his rock. She began attending meetings, her voice cold and unwavering. "We have to hit harder, Antonio. For our son." Vincenzo answered the Chicago attack with one of his own. One night, a Rossi smuggling boat exploded in the harbor, killing 15 men in the flames. A note was left at the wreckage, written in blood. "For Roberto." Antonio read it, his hands shaking with fury. He called another meeting, but the atmosphere had changed. Paranoia spread like a virus. Every man in the room eyed the others with suspicion. "We have another traitor," Antonio said, his voice like ice. He'd received an anonymous tip about a captain, Franco, spotted near a Morty-controlled club. With no proof but driven by instinct, Antonio ordered Franco interrogated. The interrogation was brutal. In a cold warehouse, Franco was tied to a chair, his face swollen from Paolo's fists. "I swear, Don, I'm loyal," he shouted, but Antonio saw lies in his eyes. A knife sliced across Franco's chest, blood dripping onto the concrete. Eventually he broke and confessed. He had leaked information to protect his sister, whom the Mortys had kidnapped. Antonio, blinded by rage, ended him with a single bullet to the forehead. But when Franco's sister was later found dead, doubt gnawed at Antonio. Had he killed an innocent man? Chapter 4. In the grip of shadows, the rain had stopped, but New York streets still glistened with dampness, as if the city itself were trying to wash away the blood flowing through its veins. Don Antonio Rossi sat in his Cadillac, parked in a dark alley behind an abandoned factory in Harlem. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the city lights burned like a promise of revenge. Marco's death, Gino's betrayal, Franco's brutal execution, all had built a wall of paranoia around him. The mysterious phone call from the previous night echoed in his head. "Don Rossi, you have an enemy closer than you think." Who could it be? Luigi, his consigliere, was still in the hospital. Paolo, his loyal giant, had bled for him. Yet suspicion was a serpent, coiling through his thoughts, venomous and relentless. At headquarters, tension pulsed like a live wire. The Rossi family had struck hard at the Mortys, but the cost was high. The loss of men in Chicago and the explosion of their smuggling boat had weakened their resources. Maria, who had risen from her grief like a phoenix, now took an active role. Her red hair was drawn tight in a bun, her eyes burned with a resolve that unsettled even the hardest capos. "We can't wait any longer, Antonio," she said one evening, her voice sharp as a blade. "Vincenzo must die." For Marco, Antonio looked at her, his heart caught between love and pain. "He will die, my love, I swear it." The plan was bold, maybe insane. Vincenzo Morty had retreated to his fortified Long Island estate, a fortress surrounded by guards, dogs, and high walls. But Antonio had a way in, an old contact, a corrupt cop named Detective Malone, whom the Mortys believed they owned. Malone had fed Antonio information for years, for the right price. Now he offered a map of the estate's security systems and the exact moment Vincenzo would be vulnerable, a dinner with his closest allies. "It's gonna get bloody, Don," Malone rasped through smoke-stained lungs. "Vincenzo's got an army in there. Antonio gave a cold smile. Let them come. Preparations were meticulous. Paolo assembled an elite team of 10 hardened men. Their weapons were top tier. Automatic rifles, grenades, even a portable rocket launcher stolen from a military shipment. Antonio himself insisted on leading the assault. This is personal, he told Paolo, who tried to protest. I'm going to watch Vincenzo die with my own eyes. Maria kissed him before he left, her lips cool but steady. Come back to me, she whispered. The night of the attack, the moon hid behind thick clouds, as if even the gods turned their faces away. The team approached the estate in 2 black vans, their breath steaming in the cold air. Malone had disabled part of the security system, but not all of it, to avoid suspicion. Scaling the wall, they slit the throats of 2 guards, their bodies falling silently onto the grass. The dogs, trained to kill, came charging, but Paolo's men carried tranquilizer darts. The animals collapsed with muffled whimpers. Inside the mansion was another world. Crystal chandeliers bathed marble floors in golden light, and the soft strains of classical music leaked from the dining hall. Vincenzo sat at the long table, laughing over glasses of wine with his capos. Antonio and his men moved like ghosts through the corridors, shadows among shadows, but then the trap sprang shut. The lights went out, a siren wailed. It's a setup, Paolo roared just as bullets rained from the ceiling. Morty gunmen, hidden in secret passages, opened fire. One of Antonio's men went down instantly, his chest shredded by buckshot. Chaos erupted. Antonio dove behind a pillar, his pistol barking flame. He spotted a fat capo named Bruno and put a bullet straight through his forehead. Blood and brains sprayed across an expensive tapestry. Paolo, a raging bear, hurled a grenade that tore through a wall, sending 3 enemies to the ground in a heap of mangled limbs and screams. But the Morty soldiers were many, and they were ready. Antonio realized Malone had betrayed them, or had he? Could it be the mysterious voice on the phone? In the midst of the gunfight, Antonio's eyes locked on Vincenzo. Don Morty stood at the staircase, pistol in hand, his bloated cheeks shaking with fury. You'll never win, Rossi, he bellowed. Antonio charged, bullets whistling past. He tackled Vincenzo, the 2 men tumbling down the stairs in a whirlwind of fists and curses. A blade slashed Antonio's side, lightning pain ripping through him, but he drove his own knife deep into Vincenzo's shoulder. Blood flowed, breath came ragged. For Marco, Antonio snarled, pressing his pistol against Vincenzo's chest. Before he could pull the trigger, a door behind them exploded open. Morty reinforcements stormed in. Forced to retreat, Antonio dragged Vincenzo with him as a human shield. Paolo shouted commands, his men carving a bloody path out. They escaped in a van, Vincenzo bound and bleeding in the backseat. But the victory was bitter. 6 of Antonio's soldiers lay dead, and his own wound bled heavily. At a safe house, Paolo bandaged his side, but Antonio's mind stayed fixed on Vincenzo, now chained in the basement like an animal. The interrogation was savage. Antonio, pain hammering in his ribs, stood over Vincenzo. Why Marco? His voice was cold steel. Vincenzo spat blood onto the floor. He was in the way. Just like you, Antonio's fist cracked against Vincenzo's jaw. The man laughed through broken teeth. You're already dead, Rossi. You just don't know it yet. The words sank deep, twisting in Antonio's gut. He left the room, doubts gnawing. Was there another traitor, Malone, or someone closer still? Back home, Maria met him with eyes that could burn through steel. Is he dead? She asked. Not yet, Antonio said. But he'll wish he was. Maria nodded, but her eyes burned with something new, not just grief, but a hunger for vengeance that even Antonio found frightening. Chapter 5. The price of vengeance. Darkness lay over New York like a thick blanket, and in the Rossi family's Brooklyn safe house, the silence echoed with the weight of a world on the edge of collapse. Don Antonio Rossi stood in the basement, where Vincenzo Morty lay chained to a rusted chair, his face a mask of blood and bruises. Pain from the knife wound in Antonio's side throbbed with every breath, but he ignored it. His eyes, once full of life, were now cold as marble, fixed on the man who had taken his son. Vincenzo, despite his condition, smiled faintly, his teeth red with blood. "You think you're winning, Rossi," he whispered, voice barely audible. "But you've already lost everything." Antonio's fist trembled, but he held back. He wanted Vincenzo to suffer, to die in a symphony of pain for Marco. Upstairs, in the living room of the headquarters, Maria sat staring at the letter delivered the previous night, a photo of her and Antonio with a red circle around her face. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with rising fury. She had worn her grief like armor, but now she felt something else, a secret that threatened to tear everything apart. Antonio had begun to suspect her, his glances heavy with doubt, and it cut deeper than any knife. But Maria had her own plan, one she kept even from her husband. She had contacts, old friends from Sicily, who could turn the war to their advantage. But at what cost? Paranoia spread like a plague through the Rossi family. Paolo, the loyal giant, patrolled the headquarters with a gun in his hand, his eyes flicking toward every shadow. Luigi, now back from the hospital, limped on crutches, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had begun tracing the letter's origin, tracking it to a mailbox in Queens, but the trail ended there. "Don, we have to end this fast," he told Antonio in a late-night meeting. "The Mortys still have men out there, and that letter, it's a warning." Antonio nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Maria, on the mysterious phone call, on the voice that said, "An enemy closer than you think." The plan for Vincenzo's death was already in motion. Antonio had decided it would happen publicly, a show of power that would shake the Morty family to its core. They had learned that Morty's last loyal capos would gather in a secret Manhattan club, a final desperate meeting to plan a counterattack. Antonio saw his chance. "We blow the whole place up," he told Paolo, his voice hard as steel. "No one survives," Paolo nodded, but his face was troubled. "And Vincenzo, Don, what do we do with him?" Antonio stared out into the night. "He watches his world burn, then I take him." Preparations were feverish. Luigi coordinated with his contacts, smuggling explosives hidden in wine crates. Paolo drilled the remaining men, now just a handful after the war's losses. Maria, insisting on joining, surprised everyone by producing a map of the club's secret exits. "How do you know this?" Antonio asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Maria met his gaze without blinking. "I have my ways, Antonio, trust me." But he couldn't, not completely. The letter with the red circle hung between them like a shadow. The night of the attack, the air was thick with tension. Antonio, Paolo, and 8 men moved like ghosts through Manhattan's streets, their faces hidden under caps. Maria had insisted on coming, her pistol tucked beneath a long coat. "For Marco," she said, and Antonio couldn't say no. The club lay in a basement beneath a jazz bar, its entrance guarded by 2 men who were swiftly dispatched with silenced pistols. Inside, music pulsed as Morty's capos sat around a table, unaware that death crept closer. The charges were planted quietly, tucked beneath tables and into ventilation shafts. Antonio gave the signal, and his team slipped away. The explosion shook the entire block. Fire roared into the night, glass rained onto the street, and screams pierced the darkness. Morty's capos were gone, their bodies charred in the wreckage. But when Antonio turned to celebrate, he saw Maria was missing. Panic gripped him. "Find her," he shouted to Paolo. They scoured the chaos, but she was nowhere to be found. Back at the safe house, Vincenzo waited, still chained, his smile wider now. "She's gone, isn't she?" he taunted. Antonio hit him so hard the chair toppled. "Where is she?" he snarled. Vincenzo laughed, blood dripping from his mouth. "You've never seen what's been right in front of you, Rossi." Before Antonio could respond, Paolo burst in. "Don, we found something." He threw a new letter onto the table, this one with a note. "Come to the docks, alone. Or she dies." Antonio drove to the docks, his heart pounding with fear and rage. There, in the shadow of an old crane, stood Maria, bound and guarded by a man Antonio knew all too well, Detective Malone. The corrupt cop had played them all, selling information to both sides for maximum profit. "You should have listened, Rossi," Malone said, gun pressed to Maria's temple. "Morty paid better." Antonio raised his own gun, his hands shaking. "Let her go," he said, voice raw. Before anyone could move, a shot rang out. Malone collapsed, blood spraying from his forehead. Behind him stood Luigi, crutches tossed aside, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Nobody touch his family," he said. Maria ran to Antonio, tears in her eyes. "I tried to warn you," she whispered. "I was working with Sicily to take Malone down." Antonio held her tightly, his doubts dissolving, though the hurt remained. Back in the basement, Antonio faced Vincenzo one last time. The Morty family was shattered, their capos dead, their empire in ruins. "Any last words?" Antonio asked, gun aimed at Vincenzo's heart. Vincenzo smiled, his eyes empty. "You're no better than me, Rossi. We're all monsters." Antonio pulled the trigger. The bullet punched clean through, and Vincenzo crumpled dead. The next day, Antonio and Maria stood at Marco's grave, their hands entwined. The war was over, but victory felt hollow. "We did it for him," Maria said softly. Antonio nodded, his heart heavy. He had taken his revenge, but at what cost? The family was decimated, his soul scarred. As they walked away, one memory lingered. Marco's laughter, his voice saying, "You're my hero, Papa." Antonio wept silently, and for the first time in decades, he felt like a man, not a godfather. Epilogue: the ashes of an empire. The years after the revenge drifted like a foggy river through the streets of New York, where the name of the Rossi family was now whispered with both fear and respect. Don Antonio Rossi, once the invincible godfather, sat in his old office, his hair now as grey as the ashes from the warehouses he had burned. Vincenzo Morti's death had been the climax, a bullet through the heart, echoing like a final chord in a bloody symphony. But the victory had left him hollow, a shell of a man who wandered through his days haunted by Marco's ghost. Maria stood by his side, her fiery red hair now streaked with silver, her eyes softer, yet still burning with the fire that had carried them through the war. They rebuilt the empire, piece by piece, with new alliances and old loyalties. Paolo, the loyal giant, became his new consigliere after Luigi's retirement, his scars a map of the battles they had survived. But the loss of Marco hung like a shadow over it all. Every Sunday, Antonio visited the grave, laid roses on the stone, and whispered stories of vengeance. "We won, my boy," he said, though his voice cracked with grief. The city had changed. New clans rose from the ashes, young wolves sniffing for weakness. Antonio felt it in the air. The cycle of violence continued, relentless as the tide. One evening, as he sat with Maria on the balcony, gazing over the city lights, he asked, "Was it worth it?" She took his hand, her grip firm. "For Marco, yes, but now it's time to let go." They decided to retire, leaving the empire to Paolo, and moved to a small villa in Italy, where the olive trees whispered memories of Antonio's childhood. But in the Mafia world, there was no true retirement. One night they came, shadows from the past, avengers of the Mortys. The gunfire echoed, blood flowed once more, but Antonio died with a smile, pistol in hand, Maria at his side. Their bodies were found together, a final testament to their love. The Rossi family lived on, but the legend of Don Antonio and his vengeance became a warning. Blood buys revenge, but the price is the soul.
Epilog. Askan av imperiet åren efter hämnden flöt som en dimmig flod genom New Yorks gator, där Rossi-familjens namn nu viskades med både rädsla och respekt. Don Antonio Rossi, den en gång oövervinnelige gudfadern, satt i sitt gamla kontor, håret nu grått som askan från de brinnande lagren han hade förstört. Vincenzo Morettning död hade varit klimaxet, en kula genom hjärtat som ekade som ett slutligt ackord i en blodig symfoni. Men segern hade lämnat honom tom, en skal av en man som vandrade genom dagarna med Marcos spöke som ständigt sällskap. Maria stod vid hans sida, hennes röda hår nu sträckat med silver, hennes ögon mildare men fortfarande fyllda av den eld som hade drivit dem genom kriget. De hade återuppbyggt imperiet, bit för bit, med nya allianser och gamla lojaliteter. Paolo, den lojala jätten, hade blivit hans nya konsiglier efter Luigning-pensionering. Hans är en karta över striderna de överlevt. Men förlusten av Marco hängde som en skugga över allt. Antonio besökte graven varje söndag, lade rosor på stenen och viskade historier om hämnden. Vi vann, min pojke, sa han, men rösten bröts av sorg. Staden hade förändrats. Nya klaner steg upp ur askan, unga vargar som sniffade efter svaghet. Antonio kände det i luften, cykeln av våld fortsatte, obeveklig som tidvattnet. En kväll, medan han satt med Maria på balkongen och tittade ut över stadens ljus, sa han, var det värt det? Hon tog hans hand, hennes grepp starkt. För Marco, ja. Men nu är det dags att släppa taget. De beslutade att dra sig tillbaka, lämna imperiet till Paolo och flytta till en liten villa i Italien där olivträden viskade minnen från Antonios barndom. Men i maffiavärlden fanns ingen verklig pension. En natt kom då, skuggor från det förflutna, hämnare för Morettning. Skotten ekade, blod flöt igen, men Antonio dog med ett leende, pistolen i handen, Maria vid sin sida. Deras kroppar hittades tillsammans, ett sista testamente till deras kärlek. Rossi-familjen levde vidare, men legenden om Don Antonio och hans hämnd blev en varning. Blod köper hämnd, men priset är själen.